it has cell bodies which are stimulated by what preganglionic sympathetic neurons in the adrenal medulla. But unlike the other ganglia, they don't extend an axon. They don't have post-ganglionic axon, right, to the target organ. They instead release what? Epinephrine, they're like endocrine gland cells. They release epinephrine into the blood, and then epinephrine circulates and works on right adrenergic receptors, mostly beta receptors. Yeah. So this is sympathetic. Let's look at parasympathetic organization. Parasympathetic nervous system, we also need origin, right? We need an origin. Where will the preganglionic come from? And then eventually, where will the postganglionic kind of go, right? So we also have right structures in the end. So the origin of parasympathetic preganglionic reward usually comes from the cranial, like the brain stem to be specific. These guys, the origins are somewhere in the brain stem, and then in the what? In the sacrum, S2 intermediolateral nucleus, right? So the same thing that we said about the spinal cord, S2 to S4 level of the spinal cord. So remember, the origin of sympathetic is what? T1 to L, thoracic and lumbar, intermediolateral nucleus. For parasympathetic, origin is the nuclei are somewhere in the brain stem, and then the intermediolateral nuclei of S2 to S4. That's the origin of parasympathetic. Now, in the brainstem, which nucleus should we know? We should know some nuclei, right? The first one you should know here in the brainstem would be what? Edinger-Westphal. Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is in the midbrain. Origin. Then there are salivatory nuclei in the medulla, right? Yeah, as well. So brainstem, Edinger-Westphal, salivatory nuclei. In the sacral part of the spinal cord, intermediolateral nuclei of S2 to S4. Origin of parasympathetic. So same thing. So the preganglionic, right? Preganglionic, they originate from these locations. The preganglionic are going to leave all these points. So the preganglionic neurons coming from the Edinger-Westphal is going to be carried by what? Carried by cranial nerve 3, right? The preganglionic, parasympathetic. The preganglionic parasympathetic coming from Edinger-Westphal will be carried by what? Cranial 3. And remember, we're also going to have ganglia here as well. We're going to have a bunch of ganglia where they're going to kind of synapse, like a relay system. Synapse and then, yeah, send the postganglionic, right, to the receptors. Yeah. So this one, the ganglia will be what? Ciliary, right? Ganglia. For the preganglionic neuron coming from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus in the brainstem, carried by cranial 3, is going to end up in the ciliary ganglia and then send post-ganglionic, right to the eye. Then we have salivatory nuclei. Salivatory nuclei also has a bunch of preganglionic neurons. Some of them will follow what? Some of them will follow cranial nerve 7. Cranial 7. And they end up in ganglia like sphenopalatine ganglion, as well as sphenopalatine ganglion, and there's one other one, yeah, for cranial 7, maxillary, submaxillary ganglion. And then where will sphenopalatine go? Sphenopalatine will send postganglionic neuron toward lacrimal gland, lacrimal gland, and then submaxillary we send to what? To sublingual and submaxillary salivary glands. Yeah, and then they're also going to supply like the mucosal surfaces, right? Those locations as well. Yeah, mucosal glands. All right. Salivatory nuclei also sends what? Pre-ganglionic from there, right? Through cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, through the otic ganglia, and then from the otic ganglia, it's going to send postganglionic to what? To parotid gland, as well as the mucosal surfaces in the mouth. Yeah, to supply the glands there. So that's going to be done. Then you remember our intermedullary. So you can see how parasympathetic ends up supplying the head and neck, right? Basically, structures there. For sympathetic, it uses what? The paravertebral ganglia to go all the way to the neck. Cervical ganglia supplies the head and neck. Parasympathetic uses what? Brainstem nuclei, which will travel through cranial nerves to their respective ganglia and then to the glands. And then we have intermediolateral nuclei, right? Intermediolateral nuclei, that will be, this is in the pelvic region, right? Sacral region. So this also supplies, this has its own preganglionic, right? Parasympathetic. And then the preganglionic will end up becoming pelvic nerve as well. I think this is what they call pelvic nerve, pelvic splanchnic nerve. Yeah. There's pelvic splanchnic nerve will actually what it's going to form. Pelvic splanchnic nerve is going to form some ganglia in the pelvic region, likely hypogastric ganglion, or no, not hypogastric, in the wall rather, in the wall of the artery. So it's like intramural ganglia, and then supplies what? The pelvic viscera, structures the pelvis, like the bladder and things like that, prostate gland. See, yeah. Also from the brainstem, cranial nerve 10. Yeah, cranial nerve 10, vagus nerve. Yes, which also intramural structures, ganglion, and then going to supply what? Thoracic, thoraco-abdominal viscera structures. So the heart, the lungs, the GIT, right? Through cranial nerve 10, parasympathetic. Yeah. So this is organization, right, of the parasympathetic. High yield anatomy, right, at this level. Preganglionic neuron and Westphal in the midbrain, through cranial 3, ciliary ganglion, then to the eye. So the pupil, pupillary size, things like that is how we control that. Cranial 7, from salivatory nuclei in the brainstem medulla, right? It has double ganglia, right? Sphenopalatine, submaxillary. So sphenopalatine will end up supplying the lacrimal gland, submaxillary, sublingual, submaxillary, right? That's how lacrimation, salivation, right? And F7. Then 9 and 10 from salivatory nuclei, as well as I think 9 also has its own special nucleus. So through otic ganglion for 9, parotid gland. Through 10, intramural, it's going to end up in the intramural ganglion. Those are ganglion in the wall of the viscera itself, like wall of the heart, the GIT, and it's going to supply the visceral organs, right? The thoracic and the abdominal and the abdomen. And then we have the S2 to S4 intermediolateral nuclei, which supply give up the pelvic splanchnic, preganglionic. Also, that one we also form connection with the intramural ganglion in the pelvic visceral organs, like the bladder, things like that. Yeah. So this is how parasympathetic, right, is kind of organized. In parasympathetic, what will be the neurotransmitter for the preganglionic? All of them will also use words. So all the pre will also be what? Acetylcholine, cholinergic. So the preganglionic neurons in both sympathetic and para, they are all what? Preganglionic neurons. While the postganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic are also, they are cholinergic, acetylcholine, cholinergic neurons, all of them are cholinergic. Unlike sympathetic, where pre are also cholinergic, But the post are mostly what adrenergic, except what the sweat gland, cholinergic. In parasympathetic, pre are all cholinergic, post are also what? All cholinergic. So the receptor on the cell bodies in the ganglia are going to be also nicotinic neuronal receptors to interact with the acetylcholine released by what? The preganglionic. But then at the end organ, that's where we're going to have what? Our muscarinic receptors, M1, M2, M3, right? M4, M5, muscarinic receptors. Or the postganglionic, right? Parasympathetic neurons to interact with on the end organs. So this para organization. Shani, you said?
I was asking if you can repeat that, please, regarding the difference with the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, cholinergic versus adrenergic.
So we know the preganglionic fibers, right, for both of them. All right. What is the neurotransmitter for the preganglionic in both cases? Acetylcholine. So the preganglionic in sympathetic as well as the preganglionic in para, they are all cholinergic neurons. Okay, so that is common. So which means the ganglia in all of them, both simple and parasympathetic, the ganglia, which means the cell bodies that will interact, that will be stimulated by the preganglionic, will have which receptors? Nicotinic neuronal receptor. That they can interact with the acetylcholine release, right, by the preganglionic. Yeah, basically. Now, the postganglionic neurons for the sympathetic, because this is not sympathetic, right? They are mostly what? Adrenergic neurons. The postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic, they are all adrenergic. In other words, they release what? Norepinephrine. Norepinephrine, except what? The adrenal medulla, right? Adrenal medulla releases what? Mostly epinephrine and some norepinephrine as well, right? But the postganglionic neurons come from the ganglia for sympathetic. Besides adrenal medulla, they all usually release what? Norepinephrine, not epinephrine. And which means the receptor on the end organ for the postganglionic, right? Sympathetic neurons will be alpha and beta receptors, which are the receptors that can interact with what? Norepinephrine and epinephrine. Now, there's one exception to that rule. The exception to that rule for the postganglionic sympathetic is what? Is the postganglionic sympathetic neuron that supplies what? The sweat glands in the skin. The postganglionic sympathetic neuron that supplies the sweat glands in the skin, it is not adrenergic neuron, it is a cholinergic neuron. It actually makes acetylcholine, not norepinephrine. Yeah, so that's the exception for sympathetic. Every postganglionic, they are adrenergic, norepinephrine, for sympathetic, except the postganglionic neuron that supplies the sweat glands, which is cholinergic. It makes acetylcholine, which will stimulate what? Muscarinic receptors, right, on the sweat glands in the skin. But in parasympathetic, all the postganglionic, right, parasympathetic neurons are what? They are all cholinergic neurons. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter, which means their receptor that they're going to stimulate on the end organs will be what? Muscarinic receptors. Yeah. Make sense?
Thank you.
That is